Hello, and welcome once again to another episode of Interesting Stories in the History of Diagnostics. This is Mickey Urdea for Halteres Associates. And today I'm going to talk about breath analysis, or the use of breath in the diagnosis of specific diseases. The use of breath in diagnosis in one manner or another has been around for a long time. There are early reports in the time of Hippocrates talking about the fact that physicians should recognize that the smell of sweetness from the breath is usually associated with diabetes, and that you can tell the presence of potential kidney disease if there's a fishy odor from their mouth. Very interesting. But it took some time before this was systematically analyzed, and there were a lot of common practices all over the world, but it wasn't really until the time of Antoine Lavoisier, late 1700s, where there was a systematic attempt to try to identify the compounds in human breath. In fact, Lavoisier studied respiration for some time. He, of course, was the discoverer of oxygen and also silicon, by the way. But it was the oxygen discovery that made him very interested in what's transpiring in transpiration. So he was looking at what specific compounds were present in breath. His studies came up a little short, if you know what I mean, come late in his career. The field didn't really take off until 1971, when Linus Pauling discovered that the breath of a human was very complex. In fact, he discovered that there were over 200 different compounds, or what are called volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. He noted that there were at least 200 different compounds, and even today we think it's probably around 300. So things started taking off after that, but limited initially from the point that people were looking at individual types of gases, usually, that were associated with a particular disease. So, for instance, again, with diabetes, acetones are commonly found. And then in the case of renal disease, it's usually ammonia. In the case of liver disease, it's often hydrogen sulfide. And then situations such as identification of alcohol from alcohol abuse, lots of different breathalyzers out there. And another common test is for Helicobacter pylori, which causes, of course, ulcers. Gastric ulcers, and the compound that's looked for there is urea, which is a component that is involved in the metabolism of Helicobacter. But beyond these single marker breath analyses, there's a big focus now on looking at a much broader set of VOCs. But, we think about this, the fact that a lot of other types of samples are used in diagnostics. Of course, blood can be cerebrospinal fluid, can be urine, many others. Many of them are, to at least some extent, invasive. Of course, urine is not. But the desire of having something very, very simple, you can perform it anywhere with breath, blowing into something, is very attractive for non-invasive diagnostics. There are a number of other types of materials, though, beyond breath that are being used for VOC analysis. They involve, for instance, saliva, interstitial fluids, urine, stool, cerebrospinal fluid, and then blood, sweat, and tears. All of those things are subjects of significant studies looking for patterns of VOCs in those particular materials. So I'm not going to talk more about that today, but recognize that's going on. I would say most of those are further behind than is breath analysis, but they're coming along. So back to breath. There are three major mechanisms of the appearance of these VOCs in breath. Three pathways. The first is what's called the fat, blood, air path. And this is where fats are releasing compounds that are gaseous in nature within blood. The blood then releases it into the air in the lungs, and then that ends up into the breath. So that's mechanism number one. And that actually is associated to a great extent with oncology markers for VOCs. The second path has to do with the cells that line the alimentary tract, the stomach, the colon, where VOCs can be released, and then some of that material gets up into the breath. So that's a second form. And then the third one is from pathogens. Pathogens in the alimentary tract or in the respiratory tract, who are either producing metabolites of their own that are being detected in the form of VOCs, or they're altering the local metabolism so that new VOC patterns are arising from the infection itself. As I mentioned, people looking at a much larger variety of compounds now than simply ammonia or acetone. For instance, there are a whole group of organic materials, alcohols, alkanes, alkenes, aromatic compounds, amines, and beyond simply words that start with A, terpenes and sulfides and a number of other compounds. And there are many studies in literature showing those patterns and your ability to detect different quantities of them in different disease states. So there are many different disease states which are being looked at with these VOCs. So things associated with the respiratory tract, for instance, looking at everything from lung cancer, COPD, TB infection, as a matter of fact, and SARS-CoV-2 infection. And I'll come back to both of those in a little while. So moving from the respiratory tract to the alimentary tract, of course, things such as gastric diseases in general, gastric cancer, and colorectal cancer. But also there have been metabolic associated diseases which are monitored with VOCs, such as fructose or lactose intolerance. So a number of different applications with a number of different compounds being detected for use there. But beyond just the obvious ones like this, it's rather surprising that people have found association of VOCs with everything from Alzheimer's disease, graft rejection, cystic fibrosis, diabetes, liver cancer, kidney cancer, a number of things that are not specifically associated directly within those tracts, but they're probably associated with the fat to blood, blood to air path again, so that you end up finding materials associated with those diseases in breath as well. Now, I mentioned mostly organic compounds that are associated with metabolism that are found as VOCs, but there's another trend here as well. It's actually somewhat older than breath. People have also been looking at compounds such as proteins, cells even, and then I'm going to tell you a bit more about looking for TB in breath. So that's kind of interesting and certainly beyond the standard organic molecule detection. So now I'm going to spend a little time talking about some of the companies and technologies that are being used for breath analysis. And I'm going to put these into three categories, and they're not completely clean categories, but it works pretty well. The first one being breath collection and laboratory analysis, one type. Second type, direct breath analysis of VOCs. And then the third being detection of other components in breath, along lines of proteins and cells, as I mentioned earlier. There are a lot of companies out there working in this area, and I'm only going to touch the surface. But you're going to find that a lot of them have the word breath in their name somehow. For instance, Breath Spec, Breath DX, and there are others I'll come to in the other categories. But in this first category, Breath Spec, Breath DX, both are in the business of collecting breath, condensate usually, where you breathe into a device. There are a lot of different designs out there, and usually there's a cooling component of it to take the breath and condense it into liquid and collect that material and usually ship it to a place to be analyzed. Other companies in this area, ImSpecs, Atonarp, love that name. And these are typically laboratory instruments that are based on GC mass spec. So, that's a very common way to analyze this type of compound for other purposes as well. There are some problems with this approach, though. For one, I think it took a long time for people to realize that the breath condensate isn't necessarily the same as the original breath material. It can become oxidized or modified in some way, which means that you're really not looking at what was there biologically. You're looking at something somewhat modified from that. And the extent of that is not always the same. So I think it's been difficult for people to get really great reproducible results unless there are very big differences in compounds in disease state and the normal state because of this issue. And I'll come back to another example of that in a couple moments. The other problem is that there tend to be large, expensive instruments, although there is a significant push to decrease the size of mass specs, and there's been a lot of success there. But most of the ones I've seen so far, most of the companies I've seen so far that are using breath condensate are using the larger systems in laboratories, probably because of the sensitivity, specificity required from them. The second type of company I mentioned was the direct breath analysis of VOCs. Companies in that area are, for instance, Breathomics. That's a great name. They're looking specifically at ketones associated with diabetes. The company Lumen, which I think is rather interesting. It's a CO2 marker device. It's a handheld device. It's for looking at someone's changes in metabolism because of exercise or diabetes or something like that. It's actually just a so-called wellness device at this point. And there was an interesting article in Wired magazine recently where they said, and it kind of works. Another company, I just love the name of this company, Food Marble. Food Marble is doing irritable bowel syndrome testing, and there are reports out there indicating that it probably works. But a lot of these companies are still fairly early in the proof points to go along with their test. Another company is eNose. Love that name too. And they are working on lung cancer and colorectal cancer markers, and they're, I think, in late stage analysis. They are working on clinical trials at a number of sites. And one that was in the news quite recently is Inspect IR Systems, because they got an EUA from the FDA here for analysis of SARS-CoV-2. And it is a breath collection and then a GC mass spec analysis. Now, I put that one in this category because they've got a device that they say is point of care, but it was described as the size of a significant sized luggage that you might take on a trip. So that didn't sound too point of care to me, but that's what they're calling it. So I'm going with that. This device can do about 160 samples per day. I didn't see the cost of it, but it's actually not a diagnostic test. It's more screening or triage, in that what the recommendation is within the EUA is that after this comes up positive, you should reflex to a laboratory test in order to diagnose SARS-CoV-2. So you wonder how useful that's going to be. But there are a number of other companies that are pursuing EUAs as well for SARS-CoV-2, Rapid Biosensor, IMEC, and then Canary Health, who we know quite well, actually. They've been working on this for some time, and they're looking at applications in cancer. They've made a lot of progress. The third type of company I mentioned would be looking at other types of materials beyond VOCs. And I'm only going to mention one today. There were a number of them in the past that disappeared over time. I just think they probably didn't get the performance they required. But this new one is Avelo. Avelo is focused on TB, although they're looking at other things as well. And they have a device where you breathe into it. There's a membrane inside that collects TB bacteria on the surface, and then they have a mechanism by which they can dissolve that membrane and conduct a standard nucleic acid test or an antigen test, if necessary, on the material. So rather interesting, and an interesting thing I think we're going to see more of coming down the road. Avelo is a company in Geneva, Switzerland, and it's composed of some former members of the Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics, or FIND, and some of their advisors are former employees there as well, which I think is really interesting because those people know what they're doing. So if you look at these companies over time, some of the companies have been involved in looking at single molecule detection, been around for a while. Helicobacter pylori tests have been around for more than 20 years, ammonia testing and ketone testing, a lot of interesting things going on with those. But the more difficult ones, we're using several different VOCs to analyze the sample and come up with algorithms. I think they've struggled a bit. My guess is partly it's because of this sample collection problem. So I'm suspecting that we're going to see more and more of the direct breath analysis success because of the fact that you're literally doing the analysis right there with the sample. Now, their problem is going to be, of course, coming up with algorithms which are sufficiently sensitive and specific so they can be used in the detection of disease. Along this regard, we here at the Halteres, Rich Thayer and myself, have direct experience with this problem of sample collection. We have a foundation that's called the Catalysis Foundation for Health, and we've had grants from Gates Foundation and from NIH for several years looking at TB testing. And one of the samples that we wanted to use was breath condensate. So we did some pilot studies in South Korea and also in South Africa. And initially, we did them on people that were not infected and had great success being able to collect breath condensate. When we got to people who were sick, particularly very advanced TB, they couldn't make the breath condensate. So we had to give up. We just couldn't get quality samples in large enough quantity to do the analysis. So beyond that, I think there's going to be a continued education problem, convincing people that these breath tests do work well. There have been a lot of disappointments in the field over the last many years. A lot of the companies now have just come out since about 2010. Others in the past didn't pan out. I suspect that the resurgence in the interest in breath analysis is at least partially due to SARS-CoV-2 testing, because so many people that were doing other types of tests with everything from antigens and antibodies and nucleic acids and breath as well shifted away from where they were to go to SARS-CoV-2 because the money was there. And I think some of these organizations have been able to complete platforms they might not otherwise have been able to. That suggests to me, at least, that we should see them not only finish the SARS-CoV-2 work that they're doing, but can go back to things they were interested in before, now with a system in place, and start expanding the work that they've done, doing additional clinical trials, finding the appropriate algorithms, increasing their ability to make these disposables and instruments, and make them more commonly available in the diagnostics field. The non-invasive nature of them, the low cost of them, and the potential power of them, I think, bodes well for the future. And so I think that's going to continue then the addition of breadth to the overall panoply of sample types that we constantly look at in diagnostics. So I won't be surprised if over the next many years we have to add to the notion of tissue biopsy and everybody's favorite liquid biopsy in cancer. Now it's breath biopsy. So breath biopsy is the next one coming along, and you heard it here first from Mickey Urdea at Halteres Associates. Thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to our next episode of Interesting Stories in History of Diagnostics. Thank you. Bye-bye.